In this Godot tutorial, I'll teach you how to create an inventory tooltip so that you can look up the item stats of both your inventory items and your equip items. Let's get started. This is a continuation tutorial on the last 3 tutorials I did, where we created this character sheet, this inventory panel, and the drag and drop functionality between the two. I see no reason why you cannot watch this tutorial by itself, but if you're interested in the other tutorials, I'll leave some links down in the description below. For this tutorial, we're going to start by creating a new scene for our actual tooltip pop-up. So we're going to create a new user interface scene. I'll immediately rename this to tooltip. And we're going to be changing the standard control node that we start out with. We're going to change the type, and we're going to turn this into a pop-up node, as the tooltip will pop up as soon as we hover over an item. Next, we want to set some settings in this pop-up window and add some first nodes. First, I'm going to be resizing the tooltip itself. We're going to go with a 300 by 200 size, and with the little button there, we can resize this correctly. This is the size we're going to be working with, but you can make this any size that you want to. I'll then add a 9-patch rectangle so that we can add some background here. We'll set the layout of the 9-patch rectangle to the full rectangle of what we just created. And here, from our various assets in our asset pack, linked down below, we'll find our inventory or info window, and we'll drag that to the texture. Now, right now, these borders are a little bit weirdly stretched, so we're going to set the patch margins to 15 on both the left, top, right, and bottom. That way we get what we want. We'll rename this to just N for 9-patch rectangle so that our paths stay nice and short, and we'll add a margin container. The margin container is going to make sure that all the elements that we add have some nice padding from the border. We're going to add 15 margin on the right, 20 on the top, and 15 on the left. With that done, we'll rename this to margin container, and we'll add a VBox container, which will organize the various elements that we're going to add to this. Now, this immediately sizes itself correctly. We'll rename it to VBox container. And for my particular tooltip, I'm going to go with a text-only approach. If you also want to add some icons or something like that, feel free to, change the order a little bit and add a texture rectangle. And for the code, of course, you'll have to add that too, but that should be no problem for you at this point if you follow these 4 tutorials. Now I can start adding the various elements that I want to show in my tooltip. We're going to start off with a label, and that label will be the item name of the item we're hovering over. I'm going to be adding some dummy text in this label so I can see what's going on while I'm creating this panel. So of course we want this to first of all be centered as such, and of course we want to change the font a little bit. So I'm going to go over to my custom fonts. I'm going to load one of the fonts from one of the previous tutorials. So I'm going to go to resource, and I believe 26 will be kind of nice, but maybe a little bit too big. So probably we're going to need 24 for that. So I'm going to add 26. I'll make this unique. I'll click it, go to settings. I'll make it 24. So it's just a little bit smaller. Gives us a little bit more space to put longer item names. And I'll save this as 24 in case I ever need it again in the future. Now, I don't want this item name to be white because, well, that's a little bit harsh, and it's probably nice if it has a little bit of a different color. So I'm going to go with a custom color, and I think I'm going to go with a little bit of a soft green. The soft green is a little bit lighter. That fits well with the darker background. So make sure you pick a color that has a good contrast with whatever the art is of the actual elements that you're working with. Now, to give it a little bit of extra context, I'm going to be also turning on the font shadow color to give it just that little bit edge of shadow. Make sure the contrast is good. Next, we can start adding the elements to display the various stats of the item we're hovering over. For this, we're going to be making use of an HBox container instead of a label. And the reason for that is because we need 2 different labels, because we want to have 2 different colors between what the value of the stat is of the item that we're hovering over, but we also want to indicate the difference between the strength of the item we're hovering over in our inventory compared to what we got currently equipped. And we want that value to be either red or green in case it is stronger or weaker. So because we will need 2 different font colors, we also need 2 different fonts. So that's why we use this HBox container. We'll add a child node, and we'll add the first label. That label is simply going to be the stat, so the actual stat of whatever item we're hovering over. We'll put a dummy text in here called stat. We'll v-align this to the center, but I do want this list to line up to the left side of the panel. Then under custom fonts, we'll of course add a resource. And in this case, I'll add a Arial 21 resource. If you don't have that one yet, I showed you how you can make that just a moment ago with item name. Under the custom colors, I don't want this to be pure white because that's a little hard on the eyes. So I'll make this broken white with the values 220, 220, 220. And I'll turn the front color shadow on to make sure we get a little bit extra contrast with the background, and it just gives that a little bit more depth. Now with all those parameters set, we are going to duplicate this and we'll rename the second label into difference. We'll also make sure that we do that in the dummy text. Now that is pretty much it. We don't have to do anything with this right now because we, of course, when we make this template, don't know whether the item we're going to be hovering over is better or worse. So we'll have to set the color of that second label there, the difference label, in code. Now lastly, there's only a couple of settings we gotta set before this panel is completely done. First of all, we want to make sure that in the parameters in the inspector of every single node in the tree you got so far, that the mouse filter is set to ignore. This will make sure that our mouse cannot interact with the pop-up panel, which could lead to some rare crashes. So you want to make sure that's set to ignore for every single one of these nodes. Now you'll find that some of these nodes come with the filter set to ignore by default, but other ones have it by default on pass or by default on stop. So you want to go over every single one. For labels, it's set by default to ignore. So these last two should be good already. All right, with that done, we can now remove the help text that I've added to our stat and difference labels, and we can duplicate stat number 1, and I'll duplicate it up to stat number 5. Now we have 5 containers to which we can add stats. That means that our items can have up to 5 stats. If you need more, just expand the window and duplicate more. By removing the helper text, as I just did, I do make sure that everything looks empty by default and only stats will pop up as we populate these label fields. Also, make sure that with Tooltip selected, you reset your anchors, which by default are set to all 4 corners of the viewport, as you can see right here. By clicking these 2 undo buttons right there, you can set that anchor to the beginning again, which will make sure that the tooltip doesn't resize itself when you spawn it into the UI. Lastly, we of course have to save the scene, so we'll save it under our scenes, our UI scenes, and in this case I'm going to use this as a template, as that's what it sort of is, and I'll save it as a tooltip. Now we can switch over to the code, make sure that the tooltip actually pops up when we hover over an item, and populate the labels with the various information that we want to display. The first code we'll add to the tooltip itself. With tooltip selected, we'll create a new script, and I'll add some lines of code to get us started. We have 3 variables on the top. Origin is either going to be inventory, in case we're hovering over an inventory slot, or character sheet, in case we're hovering over an equipment slot. The slot itself is going to be either for inventory in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then etc. And for the character sheet is going to be the actual body part of the equipment slot. So that's going to be neck, finger, hands, legs, whatever. Valid is going to be helping us determine whether the tooltip should be shown or not, whether we are hovering over a valid item or not. It is going to be invalid or remain false in case we're hovering over an empty inventory slot or an equipment slot that doesn't have any gear equipped in it. How we get that information is what we do right here under the ready function. We're going to check if origin is inventory. We have to reference the inventory data. We have to look in the slot, and we got to find out if that is something else than null. If it's something else than null, that means there's an item in that particular inventory slot, and we can start showing the tooltip. So we set valid to true, and we get the item ID out of the inventory data. For the character sheet, we do pretty much exactly the same. We check whether the equipment data slot is something else than null, meaning we have something equipped. We determine the item ID of that equipped item, and we set valid to true. If valid is true, that's of course where we're gonna start adding the code to populate all these labels with the correct information. Let's now first switch to actually getting this tooltip panel instance into our UI. I'm now looking at my inventory slot template, the scene that we instance into our inventory based on our backpack size. Here we have the icon with already a script on it from the previous tutorial for drag and drop functionality, and we'll add the tooltip functionality on top of it. When I look at the script, I've already added the first line of code on line number 3 here, which already defines a new variable tooltip, which is going to be the preloaded tooltip scene that we have just created. Now we need two functions, one to show the tooltip and one to hide the tooltip. For that, we're going to make use of the built-in signals of Godot. With the icon selected, I'm going to go over to Node, Signals, and I'm going to be connecting the mouse entered signal. So whenever our mouse enters the icon, we're going to be showing the tooltip. I'll do exactly the same for the mouse exited, so that as soon as we leave or the mouse cursor leaves the icon, the tooltip is going to be disappearing again. Of course, we have to code that in, and I've prepared that code for us. So with these two functions selected, I'll simply override that, but these function names remain exactly the same. What we do, first we pull an instance of the tooltip that we just preloaded on line number 3. That is going to be our tooltip instance. We're going to set the origin, that is going to be inventory. Since it's the inventory slot template, we know that if the tooltip is going to be called from this code, it is always going to have the origin inventory. For the slot, we're going to get the parent get name. In that case, that will be inventory 1. But as we instance in these inventory slots into our inventory in rows, this is going to be inventory 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And that inventory 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, etc. is of course a reference to our inventory data. Then we have to set the position of this tooltip. For that, I'm going to teach you two methods. I'll first teach you the first one and demonstrate it, and then I'll teach you the second one. For the position of the tooltip, we are going to get the anchor point of the parent. So that will be inventory 1. We get that anchor point by getting the global transform with canvas. That is the only way by getting the absolute position of the UI node that you're trying to get. So that's a handy function, which I haven't used too often. We're going to get the origin of that transform, and that is going to retrieve us a vector 2. Then I'm going to be deducting a vector 2 from it. This 300 by 0 is based on our tooltip size. So if we quickly go back to the tooltip and we have a look at the inspector, I've set under the rectangle our minimum size 300 by 200. So since we want, or in this case, I want the panel to show to the left of the inventory slot, I'm going to take the anchor of the inventory slot, but I don't want it to overlap, so I'm going to shift it 300 to the left. So that is where this minus vector 300 comes from. If you've created a tooltip of a different size, you want to make sure that this 300 equals the width of your tooltip. Now with that done, we can add the child to this icon. And since the tooltips type, the node type on the top is a pop-up will always render in front of everything else. And that's why using a pop-up is kind of handy here. Next, I'm going to be yielding the code for 0.35 seconds. I do that because otherwise, if you hover your mouse over your inventory, your grid, you're going to get all these pop-ups left and right for all these various tooltips, and that just looks really annoying. So only if you hover over an item for 0.35 of a second, we're going to be showing the tooltip. Now, because of course we can leave that particular icon, and that is the second function here, we can leave the icon before 0.35 seconds is over, and then we will have freed the tooltip already. In that case, we won't be able to get node tooltip. That node will not be able to be found. We'll get an error. So in order to make sure we don't get that error, we first check if after 0.35 seconds that node still has the node tooltip. It means it still exists, and in this case we can make use of that valid boolean that we have coded on our tooltip code. Remember, we had the var valid false by default, and we only set it to true if there's something loaded in the slot that we're hovering over. So by checking if valid has become true under the ready function, and that ready function has already run because we've already added a child to the world and we're simply not showing it yet for 0.35 seconds, we can verify if get node tooltip is valid, and only if it is valid, we are going to show it. That basically means that when you hover over an empty inventory slot, there is going to be a tooltip in the node tree. It's just not shown, and therefore it looks perfectly fine to the user. Now, with all of that set, we can hit play. And now if I hover over these various elements, you can see that this tooltip is popping up. And as you can see, it pops up and it positions itself directly left of the inventory slot. Now I'll show you the other two lines of code and a different way where you can populate this particular tooltip. For the second method, I'm first going to be locking the first method with Control K here, and I'll be unlocking the second method to demonstrate to you. Here I'm going to be setting the Y and the X position of the rectangle position separately. For the Y, the height, I'm still going to get the parent get node transform with GAMEDEV origin, so still exactly the same as the line on top here, and I'm going to take particularly the Y value out of the origin. So for the height, we're still choosing the height of the inventory slot. However, for the X position, I want this to show to the left of the entire inventory panel instead of the particular inventory slot. So for that, we're going to get the node root scene handler main UI control inventory. So that is basically going all the way from the root. We are finding our inventory panel. That might be a little bit different, that path in your project. So do take that node or find that node properly. Then we're going to get the global transform with canvas of the entire inventory panel. We're going to get the origin X minus 300. Now, when we set that, you'll see that now our tooltip is always shown to the left of the entire inventory panel, but it does take the height of the inventory slot that we are hovering over. Now, that might look a little bit more clean to you. This is basically two methods that you can choose between, and I thought I'll show you both. Now that's all nice and good, but these are only the inventory slots. Of course, we also want to do exactly the same with our equipment slots. For that, we are going to go over to our main, our control, our character sheet. And under our character sheet, we have our head, our neck, our chest, our various elements. And of course, here we also have these icons, again with a script. Then the script is, of course, again for that drag and drop functionality. Clicking into that script, this is basically where we can add pretty similar code. However, I don't want to connect all the signals mouse entered and mouse exited for all these various items up. So I'm just going to go do that through code. I'll add these lines on the top, which again is going to preload that tooltip, just as we did on the inventory slot. But now also under the ready function, I'm going to be connecting the mouse entered to self icon mouse entered and connect mouse exited to self on icon mouse exited. And of course, this script is connected to each of these different icons. So that means that all of those icons are now having their signals connected up through script, and we don't have to do all that manually, 2 thumbs up for that. Now we can add the code very similar to what we just did on the inventory slot template, and we can make a couple of small adjustments, make sure it works for the equipment slots as well. To do that, I'm going to go over back to my inventory slot, and on my inventory slot, I'm simply going to be copying the code that we've just created here. I'm going to go over back to my equipment slot, scroll down, and I'll add the code to it. Now, of course, here we change a couple of things. First of all, this is not going to be coming from inventory. This is going to be coming from character sheet. Get parent, get name is still good. That is simply going to be the various body parts, which are then references to our equipment data. In this case, I'm going to go for method number 1 for our positioning. So I'm going to be locking that one up. I'm going to be opening this one, but in this case, let's make sure that we not add or deduct 300, but let add 100. So now we are going to take the tooltip and we add 100 for the width of the equipment slot, making sure that the tooltip displays to the right of the equipment slot. Now, you of course can change this however you want, but I'll just demonstrate some different way that you can position your tooltips based on your preferences. Then we add the child, we have the timer, we can do exactly the same with the valid, we show it, and whenever we leave that icon, we free it from the scene. Now, if we play this, we can hover over our shield and our X, and if we hover over something else or an empty inventory slot, valid is false and it will not be shown. So that works pretty nice. Now we can start adding the code to actually fill the tooltip up with the relevant information. I'm right here on the tooltip script, where under if valid, we have to start adding our code to put useful information in the various labels of the tooltip. Let's start with the item name, which is by far the easiest. we're going to get the node where we want the item name to go, and we're going to set the text of that label using the game data singleton where we have our item data table, and using the item ID that we already retrieved in the ready function, we retrieve the label name. If we have a quick look at our JSON file, which is the base of that item data table, we see that under our item IDs, we have our label name, which is going to retrieve us old sort, common sort, etc. So item name done, now we can move on to stats. For the stats, we need to consider which stat we want to include in the tooltip and which one we don't. Usually, when you have an item data table, you'll have labels that you don't want to show to the player as they are not relevant. For example, in my case, I have category weapon, type sword, equipment slot main hand. Well, if the player sees a sword in their inventory, I think they'll know that it's a weapon, that's of the sword type, and that it should go to the main hand equipment slot. We don't need to tell the player that, so these labels are going to be irrelevant for our tooltip. The relevant information for our tooltip is any stat of this particular item which is not null. If the stat is null, we definitely don't want to show it either. We only want to show the stats that this item actually has, in this case, attack. So, to loop over those relevant names, I have added under our game data singleton a new array item stats, where I've put all the labels which are relevant for the player and that we may want to include in a tooltip if it has a value. Going back to our tooltip code, we are looping over the size of that array. So we're going to go through every index in that array. We're going to retrieve the stat name that we're currently looping over, and we're going to check if game data, item ID, that particular stat name we're currently looping over is something else than null. If that is something else than null, for example, that attack with that first sword, which is 20, we're going to be defining the value. So we're going to retrieve that 20 out of the item data table, and then we're going to get the node of the first stat container, so that will be stat1 label stat. We're going to set its text as the stat name, attack, column space plus stat value 20. Now, of course, as we continue to loop through this array, we may have some items, for example our shield, which have both a defense value and a block value. As we have found a valid stat to show, we're going to increase our item stat with 1, making this now 2, and then the next time we find a valid stat to show in our tooltip, using our string item stat reference here in our node path, we make sure that the next stat that we find goes into HBox container stat 2 and the next one in HBox container stat 3. Thereby we're showing our stats underneath each other. Now, when we play the game, you'll be able to see that when I hover over one of these items, that both the item name is showing and we also see the stat that that item has. And also for our shield, we see defense and block. So far, so good. However, you'll find that in many cases, the actual labels you have in your item data table are not the labels you want to show to your player, as they are either not logical. Usually in a database you don't put spaces in the name. So maybe, for example, this potion. This potion has the stat potion health, no space in between. And that's maybe not the best variable to use here. Same for the mana potion and same for the bread. So you might want to divert from the original labels in the data table and make them more human readable or more player friendly labels. So let's work on that. To do this, we're going to need a new array of human readable names. I've just done that under our game data singleton, where now we don't only have the item stats that we sort through and find relevant information, we now also have the item stat labels with human readable names to go along with that. Of course, the order in which I put them is exactly the same so that we can easily reference this through code. Now, under our tooltip, as we sort through the size of item stats, the size of item stats is going to be the same as the size of item stat labels. As we find the stat name that we need to reference to find if there's relevant information, we can also determine the stat label, which is going to take the item stat labels and the same I index that we are sorting through at that moment in our item stats. Now that we have a stat label, we can replace in our label set text the stat name for stat label. Now when we hit play, we see that our potion shows health instead of potion health, and our bread is going to show satiation instead of food satiation. So this is how you can make sure that you keep your item data table adhere to certain label rules that your database may require or that you think is more handy for your particular database, but you can also have human readable names and not be dependent on how you have named things in your item database. Now, next up, we need to make sure that we can see any differences between equipped items and items in our inventory. To compare two items, I've already added a new function, compare items. But before we look at that, let's first see how we activate that function and which exceptions we have to make. We've got this new piece of code here that is going to be included in the loop when we loop over every single stat. We are first going to be checking if the item that we're hovering over, its equipment slot label is not null. Because if an item is not equipable, we don't want to compare it to something at all because we don't even have something to compare it with. This is, for example, the case if we're hovering over a lesser health potion, which will have its equipment slot null because, well, as I said, we don't equip it. So this filters out any item that is not equipable. Next, we only want to do this comparison if the origin is the inventory. If we are hovering over an equipment slot in the character sheet, we would be comparing an item to itself, which will always result in a difference 0, which is not interesting for the player. In that case, we also don't want to do these difference calculations. So with that said, we need to determine what the stat difference is. And for that, we're going to use that compare items functions that I've added below. We're going to push the item ID of the item that we're hovering over. We're going to push the stat name of the stat we are currently in the for loop. And we're going to push the stat value. That's the stat of the item we're currently hovering over. That is going to be received by that compare items function. We are first going to be determining which equipment slot the item that we hover over would be equipped to. Because only once we know that equipment slot, we can retrieve the item that is currently equipped there. So we retrieve the equipment slot. So that will be, for example, if we're hovering over a shield, it will return offhand. Then in our player data, equipment data, the equipment slot, we're going to check if that is not null. Because of course, it could be possible we got nothing equipped there. And it means we got nothing to compare it to. Well, if we got nothing there, else would run, and then the stat difference is simply going to be equal to the stat value of whatever item we're hovering over. If we don't have a helmet equipped and we are hovering over a helmet in our inventory with 100 defense, then the difference is going to be 100. If, however, we do have something equipped, we're going to be determining the item ID of the currently equipped item by retrieving that out of our equipment data. We are then going to determine the value of the currently equipped item by getting that out of our item data table based on the item ID current that we just determined. And then we determine the stat difference by taking the new value and we subtract the old value. If the old value is bigger, that means that the item we're comparing to is worse, and that means it's going to be a negative value, and otherwise it's positive. We return that stat difference to this function right here. And then we can call the node again using our item stat to make sure we put it in the right HBox container. Instead of taking /stat, we take /difference based on our node names. Then we're going to set the text. We're going to add a couple of spaces, otherwise they're going to be too snug with each other. So it's sort of like a margin. Then we're going to add the string of stat difference. Now, of course, if stat difference is bigger than 0, we're going to make sure that we set the custom color of that font to a nice, I believe this is a nice green. And of course, if it's smaller than 0, then we are going to take the color red. This stands for red. You can take those colors out from Google or anywhere that you would want. Right here, I got a line of code that we don't need. That is still from testing. With all of that done, we can play the game and I can demonstrate to you how this works. If I were to hover over an equipped item, no comparison is being made. If I hover over a potion, no comparison is made. If I hover over a weapon, then it compares it to the weapon we got currently equipped, as is an equipable item, and we can see that the difference is -90. So considering that this weapon has a 60 attack value, we expect the axe to have 150, and luckily it does. If we were, for example, take this epic sword, which has a 450 attack value, and we were to equip this, we can now see that this sword has updated its difference value. The difference is now -390, as this sword has 300 more attack points. And all of the items will have updated like this. We have no helmet equipped, so we can see that the 80 defense value for the helmet would also result in an 80 difference, as well this slot is empty, and we can of course still equip these. And if we do, then the comparison is immediately turned off, as now it's an equipped item. That was it for today, guys. I hope you liked this video. If you did, smash that like button, hit subscribe. Don't forget that little bell icon to make sure that you don't miss out on the next video. I've got a couple more things planned for this mini series, so we're going to be playing around with this a little bit more, maybe 1 or 2 more episodes. I hope to see you in the next episode, and until then, keep on gaming, keep on coding. See you later, guys.